to the cloud.
Okay.
All good. Recording.
All right. Well, we'll get started here with the pledge. I don't know, Joe, did you get my text? If you got a flag on your screen that you could share?
I didn't get that, and I don't. Everybody must have a flag nearby.
We'll just look at Scott's screen.
Okay. Perfect.
All right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome to our regular meeting for the month of April. This is our, I guess, our second regular meeting where we're using this Zoom platform. We're still kind of working out the kinks and getting familiar with everything. So we do have some different protocols in place for how we're going to be doing this. They will be put on the website as well, but I'll just go over them briefly. First of all, we're doing this because of the executive order from the governor 202.1, which due to the COVID pandemic, they don't, we're trying to limit any meetings. We can't really have those right now in person, so we are able to do it through this live stream platform. With that though, some things are a little bit different, specifically with the public comment piece. What we're asking anybody to do that would like to submit comments to us is to simply email myself. My email address for the school will be posted on the website, so any questions that you have regarding any of the agenda topics tonight or into the future, you submit those to me, we'll then go through them at the next board meeting or as soon as possible. For the board members, we are going to have to do things a little bit differently tonight as well. With any motions made, I have to ask you to say your name and that you're moving or seconding, but you do have to say your name, and specifically that's because part of the video streaming, what we have to do with this is transcribe everything. So that there is a feature on Zoom that will basically do a transcript of this entire meeting. But to be sure the accurate votes are tallied and accurate on who made the motions, we do have to have your name said, so that's shows up on the transcript. With votes, there's not a lot tonight, but we'll start out doing a roll call vote for each one. So I'll just go through alphabetically, say your last name, and then you respond with your vote, and then we'll kind of go from there. So just to get started with this, I think I'll just do a brief roll call. So when I say your name, just say here, just so we can make sure we're used to turning the mute on and off when we want to speak and that we can hear everybody. All right, so Cleveland.
Here.
Gilbert.
Here.
Mishuk is here. Rusak.
Here.
Ward.
Here.
Warren.
Here. Here.
And Yardum.
Here.
All right. I guess we are good to go. Mr. Rumsey, I'm going to ask you first, is there any additions or deletions to the agenda?
We're all set, sir.
All right. With that, then we'll move on to approval of Board of Education meeting minutes. I will ask for a motion to approve the minutes from the regular meeting on March 19th, 2020.
So moved, Jen Yardum. That what you want, Mike?
Perfect. Is there a second?
Okay.
Second Ward.
All right. So now we'll do the roll call vote because there is a motion and a second. Well, first, is there any discussion? No, hearing none. Okay, well, I'll call the names again alphabetically. You can just respond A or nay. Cleveland.
Yay.
Gilbert.
Aye.
Mishuk. Aye. Rusak.
Aye.
Ward.
Aye.
Warren.
Aye.
Yardum.
Aye.
All right, that motion carries 7-0. I'll ask for a motion to approve the minutes from the special meeting on April 9th, 2020.
So moved, Warren.
Whoops.
So as Warren made the motion, Rusak seconded. Any discussion? All right, we'll go for the vote. Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak,
Aye.
Ward,
Aye.
Warren,
Aye.
Yardum.
Aye.
All right, that motion carries 7-0. All right, Mr. Rumsey, you want to give us an update on everything that's going on?
I'll do a very short synopsis of all of the great things going on, but very quickly, just, obviously in the wake of these unprecedented circumstances with the COVID crisis, I just want to thank the board for, working together in a circumstance like this and doing these Zoom conferences. Just like the entire district, the entire community, everybody's pulling together, and it's we're getting through this. In case you haven't heard, I've been updating the staff and the administration, and I've been meeting with the neighboring superintendents regularly on what's happening. Been listening to Governor Cuomo and President Trump and Mayor de Blasio and all the political nonsense. But at the same time, just trying to find the answers and the direction for the district right now. And as of today, there's lots of questions still around, geez, when do we open? And the school is closed until at least May 15th. There were a lot of indications and perceptions and reading between the lines of some of the statements he's made, whether it's going to be longer. I'm anticipating longer, but we're waiting for that official word because it has to come from the governor. He's talked about regional rollouts, the North Country versus the city. And he's also, today said, sure, that could possibly happen, but it also would be, what would it take to what planning and what would it take to have a school disinfected? They'd have to show us that. They'd have to show us the protocols for all the sterilization going on in the school districts. Those are fine. Then he made statements, protocols of social distancing within the schools, which, obviously that would be a challenge. And then he talked about, the PPE requirements for students and staff within a school system. So now it gets more and more complicated every time we move through this situation. It's definitely going to be an adventure here over the next few months, and we're trying to read this and share and educate everybody. But I think the governor is going to make a call soon on longer or not, and then we'll go from there. In the meantime, also he's also been doing this while threatening 50% to 20% cuts. Some of that has been posturing with the federal government, but at the same time, what that would do to our neighboring districts would be devastating. So in the meantime, we continue on with the meals, approximately 2,000 meals daily with 2 meals per bag. I can't say enough about the cafeteria staff and the administration. Mr. Bracci and Mr. Harris have been down there daily. Mrs. McKenna is there overseeing everything. Mr. Ortiz is keeping the buses running strong, and of course, all of our transportation department willing and able to go out. We've been working with our friends at ProAction and the Southern Tier Food Bank as a distribution hub potentially. We've been obviously preparing for the long haul, trying to get ready for the summer months. Counseling wise, Mr. Rechtenwald has been accepted in working with the state on if anybody calls in with anxieties and such, and our counselors, social workers, faculty, our school resource officer, they're checking on the health and welfare and directing anybody with any emotional issues, anxieties, accordingly to the resources. And then of course, the big thing, instruction. Amazing stuff going on with our plannings with the remote instruction. I've been sitting through a lot of different meetings with our admin group to our grade level meetings, to department level meetings, and it's nothing short of amazing. All the folks that are sacrificing, and it's like everybody. You could be here for 30 years, and everybody's a brand new teacher now, and they're all trying to figure out the ways and the environment that we're working in, and trying to come up with ways to reach kids, and then checking on them, and they're they're using flipped classrooms, Google Class, Zoom, email, phone calls, text messages, and then good old-fashioned paper packets. Just trying to get through. Lobbies are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and we're doing checks to folks at the houses as much as possible if we haven't heard from them. It's not perfect. It's breaking down a lot, but it's getting better every day, and we just ask that everybody keep trying their best. We're talking about grading, what's acceptable, what's not, getting kids through. The principal reports will show you more detail in that, what's going on per levels, if you refer to those. And continuing on with the education process, knowing we have to do this for the long haul. Voting and elections, right now they're still under executive order that they'll happen at a minimum by June 1st, most likely after. There's still a lot of dialogue going on there. Had an update today from State Ed and from the superintendents that they've got a couple dates in mind, but they're still trying to iron out the protocols. And I know it's what we discussed this last time, but it's narrowing down to more of a requesting of ballots and how that's going to look. And obviously it could look good here, but in New York City, it would look very bad. So they're trying to figure out how to make that happen with the same protocols for everybody. So more to come. They're expecting an announcement on that any day now. Other things going on. Regular updates. We're planning summer school in multiple formats from virtual to traditional and possibly canceling. We don't know what's happening. We're waiting for the governor on what's happening otherwise. Same thing for the fall. Looking at the use of facilities, been meeting with groups, outside groups, asking a lot of questions and trying to get them to understand that it's you're welcome here when it's time, but right now it's not time, and it's going to look very different when you do come, because this is going to be a phased-in process. It's not going to be flicking the switch and coming back. There's going to be a lot of different items with social distancing and quantities of people in the building, and from everything from the one-size-fits-all large conference to the driver ed classes that happen at night, from the community. All those things are going to look very differently. And then we're wrestling with things like transportation aid. We're still trying to figure out if we're going to get transportation aid they've promised it, but then they haven't formalized it on the delivering of food. Although we're saving because we're not putting as many miles on the buses, what we've done is we've created, and it's a huge issue in this region with the large state aid reimbursements. Next year's revenues are going to be down quite a bit now because of the lack of buses and movements. And we're also wrestling between that and FEMA reimbursements, documenting to see what qualifies so we can maximize any of these reimbursements as much as possible. So lots going on, lots of amazing work, lots of frustration, but still positive attitudes in the middle of it all. And, I'm proud to say that, the school is going to be the hub of the community, and it's going to be the foundation that the community can rely on when we're getting through this. That's all I have there, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Rumsey. Does anybody have any questions or comments? If you do, just again, state your name and whatever you want to say. All right, hearing none. Thank you for that update. I just have a couple notes to piggyback on what Joe said regarding elections and whatnot. I know we will have one Board of Education seat open, as Mr. Gilbert is finishing up his 10th year here on the board, and right now doesn't plan on running again. With that though, as far as Joe mentioned, they haven't really settled on how this is going to work, because I know right now petitions cannot be picked up, nor are you supposed to be going around, soliciting signatures for that. So that still needs to get worked out as well, along with the date of the vote. So more to come on that, but just thought I'd put that out there, that there will be one open seat, but we still don't know how it's all going to work as far as filling it at this point.
And if I could just add into there, President, the one thing that has been discussed is that because we don't know the final date of the actual budget vote and election, we're backing up that calendar as far as all of our announcements for the legal announcements for the budget, filings for the state. Everything will be backed up once that date is settled. And with that, we won't be recommending a budget for your approval. I mean, we'll have these discussions going on, but we're going to wait as long as possible to have you approve that so we get a better look at what's going to happen with state aid and federal reimbursements and everything else as such. So we may have a special meeting, early May to finalize the budget piece.
Yeah, and then once that date is set, then we'll go 2 weeks back with our traditional budget hearing and work back with all the other postings and whatnot that has to be done. And then also, I just want to thank all of our administrators, all of our staff that's, putting in a lot of extra effort during this time. Just saw on Facebook there yesterday how we've served over 45,000 meals to students since this all started back in the beginning of March or mid-March. That's amazing. Thank you all for your hard work and for looking out for our kids first and foremost. So thank you. Yes, on to district reports then.
I got one question.
Okay, Mr. Ward's got a question.
When you mentioned that you might have to have PPE, are we going to try to find a vendor or put a order in now? Because if, you do need that. It's difficult to get out there. So that might be something that we want to look at.
So we have, we had concerns with even supplying our staff. We have that covered now. We have some amazing individuals in our community making masks and things such as that. We have enough gloves. We've ordered the disposable ones for all of our lunch crew and our employees that are here. We're waiting for guidance though, because we don't know if it has to be disposable, what kind of covering it is, how many are going to be involved. Is it student only? Is it, I'm not sure our students can handle some of this, with what's happening here. Is it issue one and they're permanent? Once we have just an inkling of what it's going to look like, then we'll make that decision and pull the trigger, Scott.
Okay.
But you're absolutely right. To place an order, it takes months now. So, we need to move forward with that.
Right. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Is there any other questions or thoughts before we move on? Okay. Mr. Rumsey, you just want to give a quick update on the capital project. I know where things are wrapping up, which we need to have done by the end of June to get the state aid flowing. So
Yes,
are we on track for that?
Yes. As you're aware, we were an essential project based on the timeliness of it. School projects were essential. They were allowed. They weren't allowed. They were allowed. They weren't allowed. Then it became an essential project if you were in the midst of the middle of a project nearing an end and or any safety pieces. We have the generator all online now. They're tracing all the, they're doing an arc flashing project where they're tracing all the electric boxes back and doing some different labeling pieces, which are safety oriented. But the punch list items are now dwindling very quickly. And we're anticipating having all work done by quite frankly, end of May, so that our financial advisors can get all paperwork submitted in the month of June.
Good. Okay, is there any questions or comments on the administrative reports that were submitted? No. Again, I appreciate the administrators submitting those, especially this time or during these times. It's definitely good to know what's kind of going on and how we're handling things. So again, I appreciate your efforts in putting those together. So thank you.
Mike, I did have a question.
Okay, Mrs. Rusak.
Mrs. Rusak has a question. On one of the district reports, I think it was in the 6th grade, this is for Joe, one of the teachers just mentioned how much she missed being able to see the students that didn't have internet. Have we identified, how many are out there that don't have internet and tried to connect them with some of the services that are being offered? I think it's maybe through Spectrum or.
Yes, it's an ever evolving process. We've been doing that from the beginning. We had our surveys done. we've had teachers reaching out to all those students individually as well, and our principals and tech department, because sometimes it might be that they have, they don't think they have the service, but Spectrum or Empire go right by their house, and they do. So we've come into those situations, as well as we're in the process of putting things out, like all of Mr. Smith is publishing all the protocols for right now for Wi-Fi in all of our parking lots, to areas that they can get, just to download an item and upload it back up there. But it's more of educating the folks on what it is, because they might just assume they don't have it. But our percentages are growing with folks jumping in and taking part in this. We've had students from our special needs programs off campus, even taking some of our spares. We've handed out the laptops for everybody all the way down to second grade now. Knowing that we can't just hand out a computer to say, here, do this, and they've never done it even in the classroom. But second grade all the way up now have all their devices from school. Some have turned them down based on the fact that they have a computer at home that they're able to use. Others just didn't want the liability of it, but we're working through that so they can see that there isn't anything really. We want them to take the product. And so, as I said, different teachers are having different luck with percentages of students taking part online, and we're continuing to educate those folks on maybe there is something you can do with the computer that's a lot easier than picking up and dropping off packets.
Thank you, Joe.
Yep, you bet.
Anybody else? Okay, moving on, I'll ask for a motion to approve the recommendations from the Committee on Special Education.
Yardam, so moved.
Cleveland, second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Is there any questions or comments? All right, we'll take our roll call vote. Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak,
Aye.
Ward,
Aye.
Warren,
Aye.
Yardam,
Aye.
and that motion carries 7-0. Okay, on to the recommendations from the superintendent. First, business. Is there anything that anybody would like taking out of the business consent agenda? Seeing none, I'd ask for a motion then to approve the business consent agenda.
Warren, so moved.
Motion by Warren,
Yardam, second.
second by Yardam. Any questions or discussion? And roll call. Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak. Rusak,
And she looks at like she's MIA. Oh, there you are.
Aye.
Ward,
Aye.
Warren,
Aye.
Yardam.
Aye.
The motion carries 7-0. Okay, we have next on the agenda is the second reading of the updated policy on privacy and securing for data. I don't believe any other changes or anything have been made since we read it the last time, correct? Mr.
It was
Lindsay?
just, yeah, it's exactly the same. We took Mr. Smith's name out of one spot and just put the title there. That's the only change that was made. This was done 2 meetings ago. We skipped it last meeting. So this will be the second reading and for final approval.
Okay. I'll ask then for a motion to approve the updates to the policy regarding privacy and the securing for data.
Gilbert, so moved.
Motion by
Ward,
Gilbert,
second.
second by Ward. Any discussion or questions? All right, roll call. Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak,
Aye.
Ward,
Aye.
Warren,
Aye.
Yardam,
Aye.
and that carries 7-0. Thank you. Next on the agenda is approval of the annual GST Boces administrative budget. Again, this is the only part that we approve with the Boces budget. It has remained flat since last year, correct, Mr. Rumsey?
Yes, any increases that were planned going into this pandemic crisis, the BOCES have scaled back everything and rolled everything over with a flat budget for approval.
Okay, and the total administrative portion of that budget is $8,399,434. We pay basically a certain percentage of that,
Based on our WADA, yes.
correct? So with that, I'll ask for a motion then to approve the GSD BOCES administrative budget for 2020-21.
Rusak, so moved.
Yardam second.
Warren.
She beat you, Mike.
Yep,
Any
no worries.
discussion or questions? Okay, go to the roll call vote. Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak,
Aye.
Ward,
I,
Warren,
Aye.
Yardam.
Aye.
Okay, that motion carries 7-0. Next, the GST BOCES board member vote. Right now, there are 4 openings. 3 of those are for 3-year terms, and there's 1 1-year term. We only have 3 candidates on the slate right now. So, Mr. Rumsey, I don't know, do they have a plan for what they're going to do for the 4th?
I have not heard of the plan yet.
Okay.
That has not been communicated to the superintendents. I would just direct your attention that one of the candidates is our own Mr. Wheeler from Bath Central Schools, who's looking for reelection. So we have great representation for our region.
So the recommendation would be to cast 1 vote each for the 3 nominations that you have in front of you. They're for Donald Kettle from the Elmira City School District, Pamela Strollo from Horsehead Central School District, and as Joe mentioned, Robert Wheeler from the Bath Central School District. So a motion then would be to cast a vote for each of those.
so moved.
Okay.
Ward,
Ward motion,
Warren will second.
second. Any questions or discussion? All right. And roll call vote. Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak,
Aye.
Ward,
I,
Warren,
Aye.
Yardam.
Aye.
That carries 7-0, and we thank Mr. Wheeler for representing our district again for another 3 years on the BOCES board, and for the other candidates as well. Okay, on to our 2020-2021 budget. If you remember at our budget workshop a couple of weeks ago, we kind of asked Mrs. McKenna to look into projected tax rates based on a variety of different scenarios and what we would decide to do with the levy. All that was provided at the end of the superintendent's report in your packet. Thank you, Teresa. That was exactly, I think, what we were looking for. Provides real dollars and to what any impact on a levy increase would be. And also today, we had sent updated expenses as well, based on some of our discussions that we've had. Mr. Rumsey, do you want to present that, or how do we want to go through
So-
some of it?
Yeah, I'm just going to introduce Teresa here, but the big thing is just a reminder that these are based on our discussions. These are, proposed cuts to get down that $500,000 that we're trying to get to. Knowing full well that the other piece that we have playing in the back of our mind is that if in fact the governor has that unwielding power, unprecedented power to do mid-year cuts, we're trying to plan accordingly to minimize any type of programmatic cut or layoffs. So, with the basically with the employees who have already retired, we're looking at every way possible not to replace them. It doesn't mean that they weren't valuable and they weren't needed. We're cutting some areas that would be potentially programs if we go through with this. Programmatic in a sense of levels in a certain level we'll have to cover in different areas. Some of these things happen naturally based on enrollments. declines or a light schedule on a teacher, but for the most part, we're able to pull this together based on a lot of painstaking conversation with our administrative group. The one, and with the notion that we would still have time to restore, cut, whatever we have to do before the early May vote on the budget itself, once we know when the date is. So at that point, we've had 4 teachers, 4 teaching assistants. We've talking about 3 cleaners. Based on conversation, we restored a cleaner, potentially more, knowing that we're coming into, we're in a pandemic and need that help for sanitization and disinfection. And we're looking at potential things at the transportation department with folks that are driving. Mr. Ortiz is looking at routes and reorganization of that a little bit. So we could have over 8 full-time instructional positions potentially not being replaced and other non-instructional positions. So, without getting into the details of each one of those, we thought we'd have Teresa go through those cuts one more time, or those areas of savings, the cuts there. And at that point, have dialogue around what you think that would look like with the proposed tax rates. And as you saw from my one memo on top of that, I'm one of the most conservative people around and think during the middle of a pandemic, we should be going flat. I'm saying to you, I'm being told by multiple areas, multiple organizations, and looking at this, that we should be raising as much revenue as possible, and then under expending any of the expenses as much as possible, noting forward that we have potential cuts in mid-year so we can stave off those layoffs again. So with that, Teresa, why don't you run through that piece, and if you could start maybe with the just to go over overview of the assessed comparisons that the board requested, and then show the other pieces.
Okay, if you have your true value comparisons in front of you, I wanted you just to note a couple things. Back in 1819, the assessed value for the district went up to $577,000. And you can see that it was almost over 70,000 more than the previous year. So our true value went down to 14.84. Last year, keeping the taxes the same, the assessed value went down 543,000. So as of April 15th, per the county, we came up with an assessed value of 530,000, or 530 million, I take that back, $786,000, which gives us a value of 1647. And this is due to the people that are disputing their assessments. They've gone through the process. So that's what they're set at right now. So I wanted you to see that even with a 0%, there will be a small bump in the taxes. So what I did on the second sheet is I gave you some examples of home values ranging from 40,000 to 150,000. Our proposal of the 1.92% increase, I gave you a 0, a 1, a 1.25, a 1.5, and a 1.75 for you to look at and just see the difference. And that, once again, that's all based on the $530 million. After that, we went back to our sheet and went over the cuts that we had. We were, from our revenue projection, using the 1.92 increase in taxes, the 161,000 from the that's actual increase from the legislative budget last year to the governor's budget this year. And the items that we had talked about last meeting was the New York City trip for next year, cutting that 10,000. The Boces administrative fees, 8,000. The 10-month guidance replacement of 73,000. We were going to cut middle school's student supplies from all grade levels, 100,000. We had originally in the budget 146,000, with special ed having 21,000. So that would just be pulling out 100,000 out of all materials and supplies in the budget. Our TA replacements, we were gonna replace 2. We pulled those out, saving 40,000. We pulled out 20,000 in the athletic materials and supplies, 10,000 from the uniforms, equipment of 20,000. We were going to see if we could get an intern for the special ed, the 811 classroom. We pulled that out, saving 50. The new 811 teacher, 50,000. And then bringing back 2 high-cost students, saving 100,000. The Corning Hospital trainers, 20,000. The high school science teacher replacement, 55. And then last, the diesel fuel at the bus garage, we were gonna cut 10,000. You had also asked about if not having substitutes, you know, we were saving money. We've estimated like $10,000 per payday. So we're estimating 40,000 because we have May and June, and that's if we don't come back, there would be a savings of 40,000. But then I also wanted you to look at the expense listing and all of our expenses that we can directly relate to an additional cost for the district that we wouldn't have incurred if we hadn't been in this spot. I've labeled with a V. So if you have any questions later on that, you can go back and take a look at that so you can see what we're hoping for. 2 things: that 1, we may be getting reimbursed for those expenses, and 2, just so you're aware what we're spending. We've also been looking at when we get these numbers from the governor, they're based on our expenses as far as the revenues for next year. With us not transporting students, we're looking at the transportation expense to be lower than what we thought, or lower than what they've projected our revenue to be. So we've been looking at that and trying to come up with a number that, because we're not driving as many miles, we're not sure if the miles that we are driving, we're gonna get reimbursed for. So there's a lot of questions up in the air, but we're trying to come up with a number that maybe the transportation aid number that we're looking at for 2021 may be higher than what we're actually gonna get. We've been looking at other areas where we might be able to save additional costs, things to do to get more aid. We're looking at everything we can possibly think of to come up with numbers just to, you know, try and project what the future is going to bring.
And by maximizing any aid, I mean, we're directing, like, for instance, Mr. Ortiz with that shortfall, we're saying, you know, if you're going to be, you know, doing any maintenance work on the lifts or anything like that, do it now so that we can get that revenue next year, knowing that it's going to be expended next year anyway. So any type of thing we can do there in that sense, that's just an example of it. We're also, as she's tracking those expenses, you know, for FEMA and everything else on those expenses, we're going to put a budget line item right in there with projections that this is what it cost us in COVID costs. So they'll see that next year as well in that budget as requested from you guys. And the one thing we didn't adjust is we had pulled everything out of the uniforms at one point. We just didn't take that off this sheet for you today. And we did restore one of those cleaners that we talked about. And, you know, we'll look for guidance for you guys to whether put another one in. And knowing we're, you know, we've now made it to where we need to start. We're just looking now to bridge the gap, knowing this is 2 or 3 years out. If we make it, it's going to be because of the federal support on the state level. That's going to go away next year. We're already using a significant bunch of our fund balance. So this is going to be a painful process to sustain over the next couple of years. And we're making those corrections to do so. Knowing that we don't have a lot of fat. This is, you know, this is programs that we've had. The other thing I was going to bring to you, and I'll have it for you at the next meeting, I've been analyzing since I went back to since I arrived back in 2013, knowing you guys had shed a lot of, had shed some staffing back in 2008 when the big crisis hit. They're saying this one is going to make that one look very good when we went back to the GEA. We have eliminated several positions over the years due to enrollment, whether it be high school social studies, high school math. We've replaced them basically with bringing back special ed students. We brought special ed teachers on payroll with those replacements. So it's been basically a constant in staffing the last few years. The only addition at the transportation department has been the move to put a monitor on every bus. And that was based on strategic, smart thinking, so that with all the lawsuits and bad things happening on buses around the state and the country, we just felt that was a wise scenario to do. So that's the only significant area of any staffing increases in the last 10 years. Everything else has been pretty status quo.
Okay. Comments, questions, thoughts?
Isn't it great to be a board member right now?
So this is Mike Warren speaking. That a couple questions around the high school teacher replacement, science teacher. What impact does that have on the programs that we have if we don't fill that position?
That's a great question, Mike, and we're studying that right now. Mr. Siebert, Mr. Rechtenwald, and the guidance department will be meeting with department chairs tomorrow, pending the board discussion tonight. But they were able to look at that even in enrollment as an enrollment piece, where there was a little light in that schedule area right now, and they were able to shift the students to two other teachers. Another one certified in chemistry, another one certified in biology. And, as long as the other biology teacher, maybe lost their advisement or something like that, they were able to pick up those students without really impacting class sizes that much. So that was a surprise to me. I didn't expect that. That doesn't mean we're not going to have to replace them in the next year or so. It just happens to be that where that falls, the only really impact is they've been alternating ACE chemistry and ACE biology. So maybe now it'd be ACE biology right now until we find somebody certified for ACE chemistry. So programmatically, very little impact.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And my second question is around the guidance counselor replacement. Is do we have the ability to pick up those students that we would lose in that role?
I can say that
provide the appropriate.
Sorry, go ahead.
And approve or provide the appropriate level of guidance necessary to the students we have.
Yeah, there's two. I would say there are two sides to that, and that is the first and foremost. You've heard me say, from the layperson, it would look like we're kind of fat in the social worker counselor department in our district, but we have so many kids with social emotional needs right now. I think we could use more counselors. I'm not going to lie. That was one of the tough ones we went through. If you look at enrollments, the years ago, there were two counselors with 600 and some students. We now have 450 students with 3. They're still working with 200 less students. They're still working as many hours, if not more, based on those social emotional needs. So I think that's a very valuable position. However, if we minimize it with, Mr. Siebert and I even met with Mr. Rechtenwald and talked about the different ways we could have him come back for several days for per diem, just to help with transitions and work through problems. And then, utilize our social workers for they're going to love to hear that, but, to pick up some of those pieces. But I think, and we've discussed, not shifting counselors or moving anybody from the district in other areas, but there might be a counselor or a social worker in another building that can pick up some of our high need, high crisis students that really take a lot of time up. So maybe a handful go to a middle school counselor, maybe a handful go to another social worker. I think we can make it work. Am I confident? There's doubts in every one of these positions, but at this point, I don't think we have a choice, and I think we got to try to make it happen and then try to regroup if it doesn't.
All right, thank you.
Yep. I guess with that, I just want to follow up with that comment that every single one of these positions, I can't tell you, there's an advantage and a disadvantage with each one of these. And there's it's not like by not replacing them, we're not going to feel the pain. We will. But it's a reorganization, you know, just like when somebody leaves, just rather than replacing, you try to reshape it a little bit to better fit your needs. So a couple of them with enrollments we needed to do anyway, but there's going to be some growing pains and it's not going to be perfect.
Okay, any other comments or questions at this point? I guess one of my main concerns is that obviously the way we operate next year is going to probably be completely different than we're really used to. You mentioned not having a lot of fat, but one area where we might want to have a little bit of fat is on the cleaning and maintenance, because who knows what we're going to be required to do and likely not get reimbursed for it. You look at how many different organizations, youth groups and whatnot use our facilities. The fact that we're going to have to clean even extra after all that would, you know, there's a lot of costs in that regard, unless we pass it down to them. So I think that's, I guess, one of my main concerns or questions at this point is how we're really going to deal with the unknown, really, you know, at this point.
Yeah, we definitely have gone through like not knowing this was going to happen. If you remember, we went through that study trying to fine tune how we do things and use some of the better equipment and look at how many rooms per cleaner and how that was all divvied up. That I'm concerned about that as well. Coming out of you know, a pandemic when we were asked to sterilize everything behind you right now. Is it going to look the same in the fall? Who knows? We don't know how that's going to be, but we're going to be doing things differently. So
Well, just, and even the fact that Mr. Orr brought up, if we have to buy masks for every student, I mean, that could be a huge cost. And obviously that's, you know, do you have to reuse them, or are they just a one-time thing? There's just so many unknowns right now as to how things are going to look when we are able to open.
Yep.
I think the governor's kind of alluded to that, which is why there's so much, you know, they're not saying how it's going to reopen, because I don't think they know yet and how it's all going to work. So
I agree. You know, and we have, like I said, we've been trying to make those cuts. You know, I've asked Teresa to be the butcher and cut where she thinks she needs, and the admin to just, you know, to advocate why we need something and to justify that. And, you know, we'll do the same thing as we move through this into early May. So there's not really a, you know, we're saying this is where we're at this status right now. We could be having more conversations in the next couple of weeks here and coming back and saying, based on information we find out between now and the next meeting, that, okay, we need one more cleaner. We need something. But the one thing we can't risk, if anything, is student safety and safety of our public and the safety of our staff. So, you know, I don't have an answer other than the fact that we have room to put another cleaner back in if we need to, and/or those materials and supplies. But that's just one more area that, you know, eventually we're gonna have to cut something else to keep that. And it's a very unique situation where you potentially could be cutting a teacher and then hiring more cleaners. You know, it's a necessity, and it shows the essential piece of that employment. You know, we have to have that happen. So I think we should keep studying that and keep presenting you with notions of this is what it is with one cleaner, with another cleaner, with two cleaners, with the materials and supplies there, and then make that decision here in the next couple of weeks.
okay. And then again, Teresa, thank you for providing that information regarding the levy and the tax rates. Like I said, that was exactly, I think, what I was looking for anyway. And I think it's really interesting. It's interesting that we're still feeling the effects of the reval, because as people are still challenging it, the property value keeps going down. And even if we didn't do anything with the levy this year, there's still going to be a tax increase to the individual taxpayer. Just because some people don't have that in front of them. If it's on if your house is valued at $100,000, a flat tax levy increase would see roughly a $38 increase. The 1.92% levy increase that we're looking at would be a $70 tax increase. So I think we all need to kind of look at these numbers a little bit more and still get a feel for what everybody's comfortable with. But great information to have. It's very helpful.
I just want to add in that those are projections still, but they came from real property. So they could be adjustments. And, you know, I don't want anybody to say, wait a minute, you told us this. There is that those are projections only from Steuben County real property and conversations. And the second part of that is that there's still a few more challenges out there. You know, I think our big ones are gone now, but it's amazing how the reval usually works out to be a good thing. But we've had a nightmare the last couple of years trying to deal with the fallout from some of these assessments and then where they've landed in court. So it's very difficult to explain that to the community when you can project tax rates over 5-year periods and then all of a sudden you have a big spike with the reval and then all these different court challenges because of the process that it went through. So it's a challenge there. There's no doubt about it. And then throw in there for your consideration that there are rumors and some pilots that are potentially coming on board next year, which turn your tax cap upside down and create some havoc there just based on the state formula and requirements. So as you look at that baseline, if you flatten out, which is what we should do in common sense during a crisis, you actually create a crisis for 3 or 4 more years down the road, as opposed to trying to raise that revenue and that baseline to build on for the next couple of years. So just take all that into consideration. It's a inner conflict for me right now talking through this, but I wanted to make sure you understood both angles of what's happening.
Is there any other comments or questions? Our next scheduled budget workshop, I mean, it's kind of dependent, I guess, on when they finalize a date for the actual vote. But did we have one? Can't remember if we had one scheduled here. Well, originally we were probably going to adopt it today or tonight,
Yes.
but that's obviously on hold. So
Yeah, that was the plan, is to adopt it now.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you some written updates and recommend that we have a special meeting budget workshop that first week of May sometime.
okay. All right. All right. Anything else before we move on here? Okay. On to personnel. Is there a motion to approve the personnel consent agenda?
Yardum, so moved.
Gilbert, second.
Second by Gilbert. Discussion. Roll call vote. Cleveland.
Aye.
Gilbert.
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak.
Aye.
Ward.
Aye.
Warren.
Aye.
Yardum.
Aye.
Okay, motion carries 7-0. We have one instructional retirement that is in front of you, or is in your packet, I should say, and that is from Jennifer Drain, who after 32 years, 3 months, and a second generation Drain is going to be retiring here at the end of the year. I just wanted to read one small section of her retirement letter because I think it's very good. She says, "I will miss my students, their unending smiles, hugs, and unconditional love. It was my pleasure to call them mine. I will miss my colleagues, my second family, and will cherish the memories made for a lifetime. Above all, I will miss my Finny. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for the 26 years of true joy and companionship you allowed me to have with such an amazing individual. Drain, Bell, and Finney will forever live on in my heart." So that's an amazing partnership that they've had, and Jen's been an amazing teacher and just another big loss. I think I said a couple meetings ago how many, just the hundreds of years of experience we're losing with retirements this year. And she'll be missed.
And that's the part that I'm struggling with more than anything, is the quality of the employees that are leaving us are just irreplaceable. There's the business end, but then there's the quality and the educational piece, and I'd rather have them not leave us.
Absolutely.
Love them all dearly.
So with that, I will ask a motion to approve the retirement of Jennifer Drain.
Bruce, so moved.
Yardum second.
Any questions or discussion? All right, we'll take the vote. Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak,
With regret, aye.
Ward.
Aye.
Warren,
Aye.
Yardum.
I agree. Aye.
That motion carries 7-0, and obviously we wish Jen the happy retirement, but we're going to miss her. So thank you for all of your years of service and everything you've done for your students over the years. Okay, non-instructional. We have 2 permanent appointments. Unless there's an objection, we'll do those as a consent, and I will just read the names. Hearing no objection, the recommendations for permanent appointment are for Sarah McNally as a teacher aide and Christopher McConnell as PC coordinator. So I'll ask for a motion to approve those appointments.
Gilbert, so move.
Cleveland second.
War,
A motion and a second, discussion. Vote, Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak,
Aye.
Ward.
Aye.
Warren,
aye.
Yardum,
Aye.
and that it's approved 7-0. Again, with the open agenda for all meetings and whatnot in the future, anybody that wants to send questions or comments to the board, my email address will be provided on the website. Well, I'll collect all those if there are any, and we'll just go through them all as a board at the next meeting. We do have to go into an executive session to discuss some personnel matters. There will be no action taken after. For board members, just in this kind of different format here, just remember the confidentiality of an executive session. So if you want to wear headphones so what is being discussed can't be heard anywhere else where you are, or just make sure your doors are shut, and just, again, be mindful of the confidentiality piece here. So with that, I'll take a motion to go into executive session.
Ward, so moved.
Yardum second.
Warren,
Okay, discussion, all in favor, or I'm sorry, roll call, Cleveland,
Aye.
Gilbert,
Aye.
Mishuk, aye. Rusak,
Aye.
Ward,
Aye.
Warren,
aye.
Yardum.
Aye.
That carries 7-0, and thank you everyone that was on the meeting tonight, especially the administrators. Again, thank you for everything you're doing. We really appreciate all that you're doing for the kids right now. And everybody have a great evening. And Mr. Smith, I know we'll wait for your go ahead on when we're, and Joe too, on when we're good to go for the executive portion.
Yeah, there will be no action afterwards.
Right. All right. Well, thank you.
So we'll just end the
Bye,
meeting.